paradigm where you plug things together. Um, because I find it both a really useful paradigm and also a paradigm where it is easy to shoot yourself in the foot. And I'll get back later to that. Um, so this simple demo here is a simple chat demo. They are components for input. So they have a kind of chat input, which in the playground that you can open here, you get this kind of like nice chat interface, right? And then they have text input where you can just like put in a static text in there. There's a node for creating a prompt, right? Where you put in like a template and it does like template expansion. And as you can see, there's this connection here between the message output of the chat input and it's kind of connected to the user input. So conceptually it makes sense, right? Like when you put something in here, it will expand it to the template. This will go out of this node and it will go into the input for calling OpenAI. And then here you configure your OpenAI component. At some point, some text is going to come back and then you display that back into the chat message. And you can see there's this like little color here, this like purple color, which is different from this like other purple color, this like pink color over here for the node. And those are kind of like the type of the node. And if you think about it, it's like, well, what is the type exactly? Is this a string? It's not fully a string, right? Because the string doesn't exist yet. And at some point, the string will exist when the user presses enter. And then it's only then that it will like kind of flow down this thing. So it's not really a type. It's also a kind of runtime connection. So it's both a declarative connection and a runtime connection. And then this goes down here. This is also your runtime connection. And then this component is much simpler because you can do it in line. There's no IO, like there's no waiting on the user to do something. There's no like API call. This is a pure function call in Python to just expand the template. But then if we get to the OpenAI stuff, suddenly this becomes really interesting because this is going to be actually calling the chat completion API, but the resulting text is still this like kind of string connection down to the chat output. So under the hood, there's like a lot of interesting things going on that are hidden. Like it's nice to write all of this. If you're used to writing code and you have to do like a chat UI component, and then you have to do, well, this part is easy to build. But that this part is kind of a pain in the ass. And then the chat output is, well, it's the whole UI, right? So you really benefit a lot. I can go to the playground and start a new connection. It's like, tell me a story about rabbits. Oops. And then hopefully this works. Is it? Yeah. So, right, you get this template expansion that has happened and you get all of that. And here, the interesting thing with langflow is you can actually get a history of what happened, right? So this was my previous chat that I had with it. And then here I can see the new chat that I did. And then here I see the answer. So it's a really useful, not just for quickly banging an application together, but also to really gather some nice runtime data and iterate and benchmark and, just like do some engineering around your application. And all of that basically with 4 clicks, right? So I haven't actually tried building my own stuff. So I don't know how experimental I'm going to go here, but we can look at some more complex applications here, right? Like this was very simple. It's like there's a UI component, there's a prompt template, then there's a prompt expansion. Sorry, there's an API call, and then it shows it back into the UI. But if we create a new project, and by the way, this is really slick. Like I like how fast this works. It's like really polished UI. They didn't use Midjourney for their icons, which I like as well. And we can start looking a little bit at, for example, more interesting applications, which is having a chat memory. So if we look at the chat memory, we still have our chat input, we still have a prompt template, we still have our LLM call, and we still have this. And here now we do have a hex connection between a chat memory component that goes into a new template variable, right? And this is where, in my eyes, this is starting to get weird because, well, what is chat memory? Like it's not connected to the chat, but it also is because under the hood it's going to be. So at this point, it becomes like way less visible what the flow of data in the application is. I'm like, well, where does the memory come from? Like, what does it mean to do this? And at that point, I have to start looking at the documentation, and I can't like quickly say like, well, filter every second message out of the chat, or maybe I just want the summary out of the chat. So to me, it's nice to build things visually, but also it gets confusing really quickly because here what you don't see is that you have a feedback, right? You have a feedback loop from the chat output back into the chat memory. You kind of have a feedback from the chat input into the chat memory. And another thing that becomes kind of interesting when you build applications this way is like, what happens if the API returns an error? Like, how do I handle that? I don't even have like a way of connecting an error event, right? And this is usually where I see applications built this way because there's many visual programming um, applications that I've used in the past. For example, Max MSP is a software to build like art installations, like audio programming kind of things with like sequencers and events, and you can connect hardware to it. And there's like a gazillion of them. And it's really nice when it's pure data flow, right? Like when you're making music and you basically just have a stream of data, these mesh really well because that's how you connect all of these things together. There's no control flow. And at the end, you have just like more audio. But as soon as you start having control flow, for example, loops, error handling, if then else things with triggered events, then things start to get complicated. But where I really like visual programming things is if you are able to put a paradigm around the things you're going to build, which makes it entirely visible, entirely declaratively connectable these little wires, right? And one thing I want to show here is like how easy it is actually to build these things. And there's many front ends in JavaScript that you can use that I've used in the past, for example, Rete, but there's probably like better looking ones these days. I think it's called JavaScript Visual Nodes. So I've used this one in the past. It's pretty easy to just like hook your own stuff into it. Oh, it looks much better than it used to. I've got friends who build all kinds of crazy things. And if you are able to find a nice concept around like what does it mean to connect two nodes, you can get really far with these like nice little UIs, right? So I built like a particle system for a game engine in Pico 8 actually, which is this weird fantasy console. But then to connect different particle systems together, instead of writing a lot of code, I could suddenly I just connect things pretty easily. And I knew what it meant in the code. So without further talking about this, let's try out the chat memory thing just to go back into LLM territory a little bit. So what this will do is it will basically record the chat and you are able to run individual components here using this little thing. And then I think there's like a whole host of tools to look at it. So these are all the settings for this node. Really nice, really useful. You can configure a lot of things and you don't need to write a lot of code about it. You don't need to look up the API description and you can also freeze it, right? Like if you have this whole application, you're like, okay, this is cool. I got a response from OpenAI, but like all of the chain downwards from that is something I'm working on. I don't want to rerun the whole OpenAI code. And so you can just freeze this thing and it'd be like, okay, it won't change from here on out. And that kind of stuff is hard to do in code, right? Like it requires writing a lot of code to say like resume my applications from this point. Really hard, especially if you write stuff with LangChain. So, and I'm exploring this as I go, right? Like, I don't know what all of these things are. I can download it. What happens if I download it? Probably get some JSON. I'll get back to this JSON thing later on. So we now have a memory, we have a chat input, we have a prompt, we have an LLM. And so if I go back here, I can actually, there's no memories available. So it also displays some of these components in the playground UI, and you can build your own components that show up in this additional UI, which is really nice too. And then you can say, hello, my name is Abraham Lincoln, and I am still alive today. Who am I? So I'm going to have like a little chat here. I want to become president. And then I'm going to close the chat, look at the memories, see what happens. Erase the chat, go into the memories tab, and I see that. And then here I'll see the memories of no, I have to go back here, I think. There was a way to look at the memories before, but I don't remember where they are. But if I start a new chat, right, then now I will use is it not working? Well, it's not working. I had it working before, but I hope you get the idea of how these things work. I'm going to look at a few more complicated components that I also had working before. One of them is RAG on the vector store. I think I was running a different langflow before, so I don't have all my keys set up, but it's using this external Astra DB vector store thing. And you can see here things start to become like pretty interesting in terms of the color of the nodes, right? Like suddenly we have a search result red thing, which is going to be document results from Astra DB. And they're going to be, I assume, a list of JSON documents. And then you can like parse it using some kind of query language. And then this goes back into a text mode. But here, down here, you have this like weirder generic file loader that transform whatever generic data means into this like little red thing that then goes in here that gets chunked, that then goes into ingest data. But you also have an embedding thing that's connected that's green. So this is like, there's no data flowing down here. Just like, oh, please instantiate an embeddings component, but this will actually do the call to the embedding. So it becomes a little bit confusing, but I'm sure if you get used to it, you can like quickly build pretty impressive things here, right? Because for example, you do have things like whole chains of assistants that you can already use. I don't know what Astra Assistance is, but earlier I was playing with Crew AI agents. So I think these are the Crew AI agents that have a whole like orchestration workflow. And you can see there's like a pink thing, which I guess I can instantiate, a model in here. If I take like a Cohere model, I'll have like my little pink thing. I can say like, oh, the manager LLM is using 4.0 and right, like there's all these little things we can do here. I have no idea what like teal tasks type is. It becomes like pretty ad hoc as you can tell. Like I think this is where node based programming things start to break down is like for every kind of custom case, people will invent like a new node type and then it will like become hard to see what can I connect, what can I not connect. Pretty cool. All of this is pretty cool. I plan to use it a little bit more in the future because a lot of people are going to write these notes, right? Like even if all of this is pretty easy to write by hand, the fact that I can just drop someone building like a Postgres thing, I just have to, I don't need to look up any API. I can just go here and say like, oh yeah, sure. Like I'll put my Postgres link in here and I'll do this and have it all set up. And what's really nice about langflow in particular is you have this API thing here. It actually generates a whole API based on the input nodes of your flow. And then you can just hit it from another source, from another code base and prototype your application using a langflow graph. And then once you know what it's supposed to do, you can potentially, re-implement it into something that's more robust. And I saw also here, you can look at the code. So here you can see how this component is instantiated and how to modify it, right? Are there any questions so far? I'm going to assume that that is a no. So let's go into the source code and let me show you also how I worked my way through all of this. So I did open the source code. I'm using Cursor here, by the way, and I have this little folder ttemp, which I guess I'm gonna leave here. The first thing I think I did when I opened this, right, which I usually do is just like look at the directories that are in there, and then I tried something interesting with Cursor. I was like, "Hey, Cursor, there's this backend directory, right? Give me an overview of the architecture of this backend for langflow." I also looked a little bit around and say like the docs folder, right? Can see things here. I think actually I didn't put the whole folder in there. The backend is in source backend, and then I used the speak with code base functionality to let whatever cursor is doing work their way through. And I see it's been using my already generated files, but it basically gave me a fairly good overview of the things that are in the code base with file names so that I could orient myself a little bit further. And what I did was then put this into a markdown document. I said, like, just like write it out and probably chatted a little bit with it to have a more comprehensive document. But so this was basically my first step, is like quickly get an overview of the code base. And usually these kinds of things, despite having some hallucination here and there, you have to like cross reference things that it surfaces like which libraries are being used, like where things roughly are. And we can see here, obviously this is named after the folders in the code base. Like the better organized your code base is, the less work that has to do. And it kind of gives me like an overview of how this all fits together in one inference prompt, right? Then I save this, and this, instead of like every time putting the whole code base into the context, now I just say like, look, you've written an overview, please use this to continue digging into things, which was the next step, right? It's like, I'm going to be like, oh, write a detailed document about the component abstraction. And then I have this backend overview file in my context, and I'm still going to be chat with codebase because why not? It's going to look up all the documentation for components because they do have a pretty extensive set of documents around components in their documentation. But continuing, it will tell me like, oh, like there's like input and output components. There's like custom components. There's how you integrate that with the front end. There's all these like kind of details around it. And I think I used Sonnet. I'm like, this is not really good in terms of the writing. Sonnet is great for writing these documents. So let's regenerate this with Sonnet just so you can see the difference. Sonnet is great at these like kind of documentation, understanding of bigger context. I always find like GPT-4o a little bit flippant and short. So this is because I'm on stream and I don't really have the brain space to look more closely at this. I don't really like this. I feel this is a little bit too general. I'm not fully sure what context it has used. So it might be that when I was doing that, I was actually being a little bit more aggressive on the context that I was adding in here, right? Like I would go into backend, base, langflow, and then into components. And I would say like, oh, maybe I'll use a couple example components in here to say like, write a wiki entry about agent components based on what it now has in the chat context, right? Like all of this first generation thing here is not too bad. And then I'm going to add actually the components agents folder with all its source code using the components documentation in, docs components. And so those are pretty large contexts. So you can switch to chatting with non-context chats in Cursor, which are pretty expensive, right? But you're only going to do it a couple of times for your code base and then store it as a document for it. So here I added a lot more aggressive targeted context but I don't have to look at it. I just know like, okay, now Claude really has some material to work with it, which I know is relevant instead of trusting whatever cursor rag does. And now I have, in this case, an overview of the existing agents, pretty detailed, like Claude. So it's not actually generating the source code. It's just referencing the files based on cursor's system prompt, but it will give me a pretty good overview of all of this. And I might store it into this here. I think with the new features of Cursor and Composer, I think I can open this chat in Composer and I could say like, oh, write a document for each of these agents, for example. And it will write multiple files, which I can then put into my documentation. Yeah. So however, you're starting to see nested markdown with code is pretty fucked in Cursor and has been annoying me quite a bit. So what I do in these cases is just to show you how I handle these things, because they're actually really important in terms of working with Cursor. Is in this case, I can't actually copy paste all of this into my clipboard, can I? But what I can do, how do I close this window when I don't have a big screen? I think it's Control V. Yeah, all right. Let's say if I have completely messed up Markdown in this part, what I'll do is copy message, and then I have a shortcut to quickly open an editor on my clipboard, and I will walk through this and kind of see what happens. Reformat it and then put it into my Markdown file. So that's kind of a way to fix broken chats. And now comes my really killer prompt, which I really like when I'm writing code, is now that I have all the kind of overview and code in here, like this is a lot of information that should be enough for a developer to kind of create their own agent, right? So now I'll do like write a how-to for a developer on how to create an agent component. I might add some diff log, some git log if I am on the code base, right? Just so that you can actually see the individual steps it takes to do this. But I'm going to assume that this is now good context enough for the model, especially Sonnet, to write a tutorial on how to do these things. Right. And so it will give me all these steps like, oh, I might edit this by hand, but it will tell me like, oh, first create this class, then define the inputs, do some reference information like build agent, whatever the methods are. And at this point, I'm going to store the how to in my documents. So let's do that actually. So I'm going to create a new folder, 24 Word, the 5th, the 6th, I think. And then I'm going to create a new file, tutorial component.md, paste this stuff in here. I'm going to assume that this is correct. Usually I would, at this point, you should spend some time cleaning this up and removing everything that's like even slightly off. You want this to be absolutely spot on in terms of steps. Like imagine you're tired, you should be able to follow this without really engaging your brain. Because what you can do now is you can reference this and like create a component for a OpenAI agent that, I don't know, searches, that queries a research assistant. You can kind of make up your stuff as you go. And now the model has this like super explicit tutorial on how to do things. And usually it does a pretty good job, right? Yeah. So I hope you now see where all of this was going, is that I didn't even read the code. And I'm pretty sure this is like 80% close to something that actually is working. And you can do this for any part of the code base. If it doesn't work, right, like you correct this and then you ask the model to update the tutorial, right? So you might take this, say, okay, cool. Cursor allows you to, if you take it to the composer, it will like actually quickly scaffold it. Then you'll run it, you'll do your little tweaks. Now you have a Git log on how you fix the thing. And if you are good with your Git commits, this is where being attentive to language really comes in. It's like the better your explanation of what you did in your Git commit, the better Claude is going to be able to update the tutorial and potentially even add language that helps the next generation step, right? And then at that point, you can kind of iterate until either the tutorial markdown is like spot on, or you just check it in. So like, well, the next time I'm going to have to build the components, I should be aware that this is potentially needs some revision. Like maybe I forgot to say inputs should always have a key. And the first time it generated a key, but then when I tried it again, it forgot it. So update the prompt to put in to the tutorial, like, oh, it needs a key. So yeah, I doing commits is so this is maybe what is nice as well. Like I'm showing you a little bit what my programming workflow is now that I've really refined it. Is so now we do have things in here that I changed. So we have this like, well, actually not. Yeah, this is maybe not the good code base, but I will have a script that generates really good Git commits. Right? I say, and so the only thing I need to take care of is like, why I do my commit and I do something that's like kind of interesting. I say like, oh, I renamed this, I'll put in like little notes in here, which is kind of a good habit, I think, when you're programming as well. It's like overrode XYZ so that we can now do X. Like these kinds of little sentences in your source code are extremely important now. The more you use LLMs on your code, the more these little sentences that actually indicate intent will remove a lot of the burden on the model to do reasoning because they suck at reasoning, as we all know, right? But and so it's very cheap to put in a sentence that explains the reasoning for the model to not have to do that and be pretty reliable. So this was a how-to. And the great thing about these documents, which you can think of as prompts, right? Because ultimately that's what I just used it for. It's just like as a prompt, right? They allow me to be really, really flippant in my actual prompting, even though every word in here has its meaning, right? Like I didn't choose the name agent, the name component, the name create, the name query full haphazardly, because I know they will fetch something out of the context and tutorial component, for example, that will match. Like if I removed create a component and just said like create an OpenAI agent, that probably is not going to work very well. The fact that it only has a tutorial about a component in a context will probably make it work correctly, but why not just add these two words in here? And the great thing about this tutorial approach is like, this is great documentation for myself or another developer as they come in and have to do stuff in the code base. It's just like a great tutorial, right? It's like, I wish there was a tutorial like that for everything that I need to do, but now there kind of is, right? Well, so in terms of the nice test artifact from commit history for LLMs, like let's actually go look at it. Since we're here, we can just like go at this here, and then maybe I can look at this change here. Right. I have no idea what this is, right? But and it seems that they do squash mergers, which I hate. I can rant around squash merges forever, but you lose all the history, right? Now I just have this like, I don't have an explanation of like what update Langsmith from is. I just have the update of it. So don't do squash merges. You literally only destroy information. Anyway, we're going to use this, right? And then I'm going to put it into my clipboard. And then I have this like create pull request. I'll go into a little bit more detail what create pull request from clipboard does, but I'll say, what did this do? Add LangChain up component. I would like describe a little bit what I do. And this will just like, it will ask me how many tokens this is going to be in case I like, for some reason, have like package lock JSON changes in there or so. And then this prompt is actually pretty simple and we'll just create a pretty nice body. This kind of used to suck with GPT-4. With Sonnet, it's just delicious. I just love it. Sonnet is just so good at like compiling information. So I'll edit this, right? With the same reasoning. It's like, I will really want to put in like high informational content about what I do, but Sonnet is really good. And so let's look a little bit at what this command is. And then I think they will probably start to be at the end. I had ChatGPT generate this, but so create pull request, get pull request from this. What it does here, it counts the tokens, right, as a first step. And then it asks, like, do you really want to create the pull request? Like, do you want me to send 80,000 tokens to Sonnet and have it explain at length what changed in package lock? But then once I have this output, I will call this prompt code create pull request, which you can get if you just install my tool Pinocchio. It will be there right away. And I give it the diff that's coming from the kitboard, and I give it a description parameter, right? So if we look at this, code create pull request. Does it exist? Create pull request. Yeah. There we go. Generate comprehensive pull request description. It's a prompt I created like a year and a half ago. It probably sucks. Then I'm going to have it take the diff and then a description for the whole thing, full bar, and then we're going to print the prompt so you can see what this prompt looks like. This prompt is, I didn't put big prompt engineering in here. Actually, maybe I did, but it's really not rocket science. Like I think any kind of prompt, especially with Sonnet, which is so good at like understanding what you mean, even if you're pretty flippant about it. These were kind of important, right? Like the first take was like always added import to XYZ. And it was like, yeah, I don't care. So, and then this outputs a YAML file, which I can then use to just like create a pull request. Like that's less important. But those prompts, I would, especially because Sonnet is kind of necessary to do a good job on it. And Sonnet is really good at not needing much prompt engineering for things. This is pretty good. And so what I'm not showing here is like, this doesn't necessarily need to just use the diff as a context, right? It's like here I can add additional context. So if I had a file YOLO into temp, YOLO txt, I could say add a couple of additional files. Like I could add a tutorial, or I could add, just like the overview document saying like, I changed all of this, but like, by the way, here's an overview of the code base so that the diff even makes sense to you. So I might want to add, out of my two temp. Oh my God, somehow my shell is broken. Let me go back here. I can add context and then ttemp. What did we create today? We created this tutorial. And then if I look at the output of it here, it like lists the diff, but then it also gives you like, oh, here's additional context. And then I have like a little template that just attaches files to prompts, which I use a ton because now that it has the tutorial for the component and I can add even more stuff. Like, for example, use the tutorial to explain the reasoning behind the diff, right? You can add additional information as needed. And, just for the sake of it, let's do this. Don't write about the tutorial itself, just a bit to clarify a little bit what I mean by all of this. And Sonnet is really impressive, I think, because it also tells you when your stuff just kind of doesn't make sense. It tells you like the diff only contains the word hello, which cool. But then if I use engine GPT-4o mini, I hope this is going to work. This one's just going to be like, yeah, whatever. That's about the way I think about all of this. It's like any kind of thing that I add to my code base. How can I make it better for an LLM in the future to do a good job at it? And a lot of it is like comments. A lot of it is like thinking about these additional documents that I can create along the way. And you can see I create them in a ttemp directory because those are not documents that I necessarily want to maintain forever. It's just like, oh, on this day I did this. So I created this intermediate document, but I don't know if the next time we try to do this task, it's still going to be up to date because I don't want to think about having to update 10,000 documents every time I make a change, right? Especially because it's so easy to update this document. Like if I change the architecture of components, I can take the diff of my change, add the tutorial component and ask the model to update the tutorial to do so, which it does a really good job at. So I think I'm going to call it here. I was planning on actually creating a node-based system based on these markdown files, but that's maybe a little bit too much for an AI in action. Um, are there any questions about this workflow that I just showed, or langflow in general? Oh, so Pella, do you use Sonnet for your zero shot PR message thing? Because that really makes a huge difference. Yeah. For these kind of things that are, they're not in the loop, right? Like you're not going to do 5,000 calls a day. I would hit the big marbles. I would hit the biggest one that does the best job, because otherwise, well, you don't get any value out of it, right? Like, what's a shitty PR commit message? It's a shitty commit PR message. Even if it was done with a small model, you don't really get any value out of it. So I use Sonnet extensively for these kinds of tasks. I don't hesitate too much to sometimes do queries with like 100,000 token request. But of course, I try to not do that too much, right? So usually I'll use these to allow me to have then a context documents that helps me avoid doing that too much, if that makes sense. Because what I want is, like, instead of having, giving a ton of tokens to the model, and source code is usually a lot of tokens because it's this weird kind of, and like every parent has a freaking token. I do want to convey the information that is necessary to write the code in the most concise form necessary, instead of having to every time send a whole kind of weird context that I don't really understand myself. So if we look at this, for example, the token count of the file we just created, this tutorial, right, which we can also further boil down. This is 1,300 tokens. And if we compare it to, let me see, stats, detailed. And then if we compare that to source base, what's the source? Backend base, langflow base, components, or is it, what was my agent saying? Like agents? All right. So if we compare that to just like the amount of tokens in a single file, just agent py is the same size as our tutorial, and it's not going to be enough to create an agent, right? So here, if I were to take this directory, we're already at 4K tokens. Not that useful. By the way, this little tool Catter, which I generated last week during AI in Action, is become my favorite, like, little one-off tool. It allows you to quickly dump binary files into your terminal and blast it. But it also allows you to quickly concatenate files to pass into an LLM with, like, it will filter, git, ignore, you can exclude, include. So, like, I asked the model to just like add all of these cool things. And then one thing that I really like is I'm able to use stats on STDR, right? Like, if I want to do include .py, and then I want to do match file name agent, I'll get all the Python files that have agent in their name with some kind of delimiter. Like, I can change the delimiter style. If I want some kind of XML file delimiter, I'll get this. And then the cool thing is, with my stats detailed, for example, even if I put it into my clipboard, I'll have the summary of the files that have been added. Now, I guess here's something I could do if there's 0 tokens, not print it out. It's a single Go file. It was really easy to generate tools like these. So do that, like, build your custom tools to create good context for the code you're creating. Yeah, it's open source. It's in my GoGo Labs repo, amongst way too many tools that I generate. But I was also able to generate, with the same workflow that I just showed you, like, just a really nice README to tell you how to use this thing, right? And then this is like a 300 line Go thing. So let me paste that into the chat here. I think if I go into the chat here, it will disconnect my other computer. Maybe not. Here it is. Yeah, it's a really cool tool, but it took me like 20 minutes to generate it, right? And it's not like, I'm not going to say like, oh, use this great tool of mine, although you're welcome to do it. but also just like write your own, like just generate your own because they're so cheap, right? Like have them query your crash logs, have them like grep your database schema, like have them do all of these things that are really custom to your needs, and then have it generate like a how-to. And I think about all the cool flags that you would like to have, and I just asked it to add those flags, right? It's all of these features are just like, oh shit, I wish I could like limit the file size. And it's like, oh, please add a flag to limit the file size. And then it did a good job at that, right? And so like, oh, please use this library to add the token counts. And then I just gave it like the headers for tick token. So I have these other tools, right, that I've shown in previous AI in actions, but I have things again to give me like good context. Like I don't want to paste the whole code for tick token in here. I just want like the top level API. So I have like a little script to give me that because I end up forgetting all the things that I've built. Right. And so you have this, or I had the model generate this. Let me see. Let's start it on port 9000. Just to give you an idea, like you should really not necessarily use my own tools, just like get into the habit of building your own, right? Like this literally, I said like use HTMX to build like a autocomplete component showing me the things. And then I can go on here and show me that. And the cool thing is this is a dynamic script, right? Like tick token sh. As you can see, it's tick token sh, and you can't call dynamic scripts in cursor. But because this has a URL now, I can paste it in here and have it look it up. And it looked like it didn't work, but it worked one day. I'll have to fix that. So anyway, that was like a tour of how you can quickly get started with like huge code bases that you don't understand. Just ask it to write a tutorial about the thing you want to do if it doesn't exist yet. Um, I need a rag to find all the tools that I wrote. 'Cause I forget all the tools that I created. So often I'll go into Google Labs commands experiments and I'll be like, oh, I already did. I don't know what EPUB is, but probably, yeah, it's transforming an EPUB to text, right? It's like, there's all these things that I played with. Some of them are huge. Some of them are just prototypes or apps, but like, anyway, what is DripCat? Oh, it's a probabilistic cat.
All right. So we are just about
Anyway,
at time.
we're done.
Yikes. I hope you were recording that because that's another like absorbed so much incredible alpha in an hour type of thing. So
I,
yeah,
I recorded it.
amazing. Anyway, thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think this is actually probably better than if the whole thing had been Langflow. It was great. Exposing some of your magic to a wider audience as we continue to go. For next week, and I'll guess I'll come back on camera. We don't currently have a topic or a speaker for next week, I believe. Let me pull up our spreadsheet. Does anyone have something they are either really excited to lead a conversation about or would love to ask someone else to lead a conversation around? I'm just going to pause here and let the awkward silence fill out. You can hop into that spreadsheet to see some of the things we have covered before, things we are continuing to cover. I will mark off that I did this one. But yeah, would love to. This is in case those you weren't following in the channel. Manuel committed to this last week because we didn't have anyone. I pinged this morning and he used this as a way to jump into exploring and running. So you are welcome to use this as a reason to dive into something you've been meaning to dive into and then talk it through with some interested folks. All right. I will leave, since nobody's jumping up and down, I will leave this for a conversation in the channel, but excited to see what comes for us next week. Since we do have 5 minutes left, Any more questions for Emmanuel or any more fun stuff to share?
Yeah, I do think that Cursor's reign of like, this is the AI IDE are going to be over very soon. What I wish people would build, because I don't have the time or experience to do it, as a diff model. Like I think their apply diff is the best feature of Cursor, because it just, as the model get better, right? You spend like 90% of your time just copy pasting from the model into your source code. That's not what I want to do as a job. I don't want to be to copy paste slave with a LLM. So any of you model builders out there, like that's, I think that'd be great. I think they have a really custom model. Like I don't even know if it's like a huge, like if they did the whole pre-training themselves. Like I don't know if they based that on one of the LLMs at all.
Yeah, as I understand it, they have two distinct custom models at Cursor. They have their Copilot++, which is some sort of their own fine-tuned autocomplete, and then they have this diff API that they use, or diff model, sorry, that they use when they're applying larger scale chat generated changes. Those are places where the massive amounts of money they've raised kind of make sense if they need to keep building and training those models. And that is a place where they could continue to differentiate unless somebody else takes that on. And I think that's probably a place where, until we get somebody releasing a model in that domain, it's going to be harder for open source editors to compete, even though they can do amazing new things with, exposing context APIs and things like that.
Well, although I'm curious, like I didn't even try it with like 4.0 mini. If you just ask it, like, here's two files, can you merge them? I wonder how good of a job it does, just like right out the bat.
Yeah, I tried to get Sonnet to generate a diff that I could apply when at some point when Cursor was barfing and I was like, oh, Sonnet, take this file, change it this way, whatever. And it gave me something nice. I was like, all right, cool. Can you like make that as a diff? And it barfed. It did not make an applicable diff. I think part of where I ran into issues there is I was up against the file size of what Sonnet was willing to output in a single inference. But yeah.
I was muted, but so I built this tool like a year ago called differential, because I was like, oh, what if we created DSL with this, right? Like models are going to be pretty good with things like replace this function with this function, right? Instead of saying like replace line 64 with this like weird thing with a plus in the front. So I started playing with this, like there's different verbs. And back then, I think it was 3.4, 3.5, and 4 times. It was like not really fully understanding these things, but this worked way better than I thought it would. And it might be a time to also just like, oh, well, instead of like just generating the source code, can we fine tune a smaller model to just like output stuff like this, right? Like replace this function with this function. Like this is some pretty clear cut LLM-esque output, right? And then the way of applying it is actually fairly simple. So I wonder if there's like things to be done here, taking a completely different approach. Yeah, because I think either they actually generate diffs, like plain old diffs, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's like that's a really bad target for LLMs. But they need to understand like line numbers, and they need to understand like diff format. Like it's just an odd target for an LLM, I think.
All right, we are at time, so we're going to wrap this out. Thanks again, Manuel. Amazing as always. Thanks everybody who showed up. I am looking at all of you all to come up with our topics for next week. So if something's speaking to you, chime in. All right. Cheers, everyone.